My father taught me that a man's word was his bond before he ever taught me how to throw a baseball. He said a man who breaks his word to his own family will break it with anyone. 19 years later, standing in a banquet hall in Cedar Falls, Iowa, I watched him walk toward me, with his hand already out and a smile rehearsed for the cameras, and I turned my back on him in front of 300 people before he got within 10 feet of me. Good evening, everybody. If you're just finding this channel tonight, grab a coffee, get comfortable, because this one runs long, and it deserves the time. Drop where you're watching from in the comments. I read every single one, and it means something to know who's sitting with me tonight. And if stories about fathers who take the long way back to standing on their own 2 feet mean anything to you, go ahead and subscribe before we get into it, because tonight isn't a short one. Before I tell you what happened in that banquet hall, you need to know a woman named Dorothy Kessler. Dorothy was my mother's younger sister. She never married, never had children of her own, and she built something out of nothing that most people in Cedar Falls still talk about to this day. She started with one bakery on Maple Avenue, a little storefront with flour dust on the windows and a hand-painted sign that just said Kessler's. By the time she passed, there were 9 of them across 2 counties, and people drove 40 minutes out of their way just for her cinnamon rolls, because she never changed the recipe, not once, not even when a big grocery chain offered to buy the formula off her for more money than most folks around here see in a decade. She showed up. That's the only way I know how to describe Dorothy. She showed up at my Pop Warner football games in an apron she forgot to take off, standing at the fence with flowers still on her forearms, keeping her own scorecard even though nobody asked her to keep one. She showed up the year the school couldn't afford new uniforms for the marching band. And somehow, 3 weeks later, new uniforms appeared, and nobody ever officially said where the money came from, though I found out 14 years later it had been her the whole time. She was the kind of woman who'd slip a cook $40 on a rough week and tell him not to make a thing of it because she didn't believe kindness needed an audience. My name is Walter Hendricks. Most people just call me Walt. I'm 63 years old now. I spent 31 years as a union electrician before I retired, and these days I spend my mornings fixing up an old farmhouse outside of town with my wife, Louise, who's put up with me for 38 years and deserves a medal for it. We've got 2 grown children and 4 grandkids who call me Pop Pop, and if you'd told 15-year-old me that this is where I'd end up, I don't think I would have believed a word of it. For most of my life, I told myself that if I just kept showing up for my kids, for my grandkids, for anybody who needed a hand, it would eventually patch over something that got torn open a long time ago. I'm not sure that's ever fully true. You can build a whole good life on top of an old wound and still feel it ache some nights. Usually when the weather turns, usually when you're not expecting it. That's the thing I carried into this story for almost 2 decades, and it's the thing I finally had to set down in that banquet hall. Here's where it starts. It was the spring of 1978. I was 16 years old, standing on the porch of a rental house on Delacroix Street with a canvas duffel bag at my feet, because a duffel bag was all my father told me I was allowed to pack. I need to go back a little further, because none of it came out of nowhere. That winter, my father, Harold, had lost his job at the grain elevator when it changed hands, and the new owners brought in their own crew. My mother, Ruth, picked up shifts wherever she could find them, but it wasn't enough, and everybody in that house knew it, even if nobody said it out loud at the dinner table. Money got tight in a way that made the whole house feel like it was holding its breath. That April, I did something I still carry some shame over, even all these years later. I took $35 out of my father's cigar box in the closet, the one he kept for emergencies, because there was a girl named Sandra Whitfield I'd been trying to work up the nerve to ask to the spring dance for 2 months, and I was too proud to admit to my own father that I didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. I got caught within a week. I didn't lie about it. I told him the truth the second he asked, and I offered to work every Saturday that summer at the feed store to pay it back, dollar for dollar. None of that changed a single thing. My father didn't raise his voice. That's the part people never expect when I tell this story. He sat at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night, and I remember the clock on the stove said 7:15 because I kept my eyes fixed on it the whole time rather than look at his face. He said, "Your mother and I have got enough to worry about without adding you to the list." He said it plain, the way you'd read off a grocery list. My mother stood at the counter with a dish towel in her hands, wringing it, and she didn't say one word to stop him. "So where am I supposed to go?" I asked him. "You'll figure that part out," he said. 4 words. 4 words from a man who'd spent my whole boyhood telling me that a handshake and a promise were the only 2 things a man really owned. I didn't understand it at 16, but he had already made up his mind that I was one more bill he couldn't afford to carry. All I understood was that I had a duffel bag and nowhere to sleep that night. I called my Aunt Dorothy from the payphone outside the Rexall drugstore 2 blocks over, because I didn't have a dime to spare for anything but that call. It was near 9 o'clock. I remember the traffic light on the corner blinking yellow, on and off, while I waited for her to pick up, and I remember how calm her voice was when she did. "Stay right where you are," she said. "Don't you move an inch. I'll be there in 15 minutes. She was there in 11. She didn't ask me a single question in the truck that night. Not one. But once she just reached over once, put her hand on my shoulder and said, "You are not a problem for anybody to solve, Walter. You're just a boy who needs a bed to sleep in tonight." I have carried that sentence with me for 47 years now. If you have ever had someone show up for you with no strings attached, no conditions, no favor expected in return, go ahead and hit like on this video right now, because that is exactly the kind of person we are talking about tonight. Dorothy gave me the room above the bakery's storage garage on Birchwood Lane. She drove me to school herself every morning at 6:45, rain or shine, and she never once brought up my parents unless I was the one to bring them up first. When I did, usually late at night when I couldn't sleep, she'd just say, "Some people mistake control for love, Walter. Don't let it sour you. Let it teach you the difference." I didn't understand that sentence fully until I had children of my own sitting across the table from me. There was a man named Curtis Boone, who ran the counter at Dorothy's very first bakery on Maple Avenue for close to 25 years. Curtis wasn't blood, not one drop, but when I needed a ride to a job interview at 17 because Dorothy was out of town settling a supplier dispute, Curtis closed the shop early without asking a single soul for permission and drove me there himself in his own truck. When I asked him why he'd go out of his way like that for a kid who wasn't even his to worry about, he just shrugged and said, "Around here, we don't make a man ask twice." He said some version of that to me for years, every single time he lifted a hand to help without being asked, and it became something like a promise between the 2 of us. My parents didn't call, not once, that whole first year. I learned much later that my mother had wanted to, more than once, and my father told her it would undo whatever lesson he thought he was teaching me. To this day, I couldn't tell you what lesson a 16-year-old is supposed to learn from a duffel bag and a payphone outside a drugstore. They resurfaced when I was 21. Dorothy had just opened her 6th bakery, and the Cedar Falls Gazette ran a half-page write-up on her with a photograph of her standing out front in her apron, arms crossed, grinning like she'd won something. My father called me 2 days after that article ran. He didn't ask how I was doing. He asked whether Dorothy had said anything about me lately. I told him I had somewhere to be, and hung up the phone before he could say another word. They came around like that maybe 4 more times over the years. The year I got my journeyman electrician's license, the year Louise and I got married, the year our first son was born. Every single time, my father steered the conversation back toward Dorothy, never once toward me. I noticed it. I want to be honest with all of you tonight. I noticed it every single time, and I let it slide anyway, because some small, stubborn part of me kept hoping for a version of that phone call where he'd ask about my life instead. I spent 19 years leaving that door propped open with my own foot, and I've come to believe that waiting cost me more than the original wound ever did. That's the part of this story that's mine to own, not that I got hurt at 16, but that I kept the door cracked for a man who never once walked through it to see me. Dorothy passed on a Sunday morning in October at Mercy General, with Louise and me both in the room. She'd been sick for the better part of a year and hadn't told a soul outside her doctor, which was exactly like her. She never wanted the bakery's worrying, never wanted anybody's pity. Her hand was warm right up until the moment it wasn't. I sat with her a long while before I called a single person. The funeral was that Wednesday. My father showed up in a Navy suit I'd never once seen him wear in my life, shook hands with people he'd never met a day before, and made certain I watched him do it, introducing himself to Dorothy's longtime attorney, a man named Franklin Osei, as Dorothy's brother-in-law, very close with the whole family. I stood 15 feet away and didn't say a single word. My mother stood behind him and said even less than that. 3 days later, my father started calling. Monday, it was 3 calls. Wednesday, it was 7. By that Friday, it had climbed to 14. The following week, it was up to 31. He wasn't calling to grieve Dorothy. He wanted to know when the will was being read, and he wanted to know it before I did. If that tells you anything about the kind of man he'd become, or maybe the kind of man he'd always been, and I just finally quit looking away from it, then you understand exactly where this story is headed. I didn't tell him a thing. Not because I was scheming behind his back. I genuinely didn't know myself yet. Dorothy had always kept her finances quiet, same as she kept everything else she did for people quiet. The reading was scheduled for the second Thursday in December, 10 in the morning, at Osei and Marsh Law offices on Commerce Street downtown. My father found out the date somehow. I still don't know how to this day, and he called me 41 times in the 5 days leading up to it. I stopped picking up after the first 15. Louise asked me once, sitting at our kitchen table, whether I planned on saying anything to him when I saw him there. I told her I honestly didn't know yet. I was still working that part out myself. That Thursday morning, the conference room smelled like fresh coffee and new carpet glue. Curtis Boone was there in a suit I'd never once seen him wear either, sitting near the back with his hands folded like he was sitting in a church pew. My mother sat next to my father, staring down at her lap the whole time. My father sat up straight, freshly shaved, wearing a tie that still had the fold creases pressed into it from the plastic package. Franklin Osei walked in at 10 o'clock sharp, a leather folder tucked under one arm, and my father was on his feet before the man had even reached his chair, hand already stuck out in front of him. "Harold Hendricks," he said. "Dorothy's brother-in-law. We were very close, the two of us." Osei shook it politely and sat down without a single comment. He went through the small matters first. Funeral costs, already covered in full. A handful of personal keepsakes going to 2 longtime employees. A modest sum set aside for the Cedar Falls Public Library's children's reading program, because Dorothy had always said a town that stopped reading to its kids was a town that had already given up on itself. My father's leg was bouncing under the table the entire time Osei read through the small print. I could hear the heel of his shoe tapping against the carpet, quiet but steady, like a clock running fast. Then Osei got to the real business, Kessler's Bakeries. All 9 locations, the real estate underneath 5 of them, the equipment, the recipes, the operating accounts, the whole of it, left in full to me, not held in any trust, not split a single way. Mine outright, effective the moment the paperwork was signed, with one clause naming Curtis Boone as general manager of operations for as long as he wanted the job, at a salary Dorothy had already written into the document herself, 4 years before she passed. My father's chair scraped back against the floor before Osei had even finished the sentence. "That has to be some kind of mistake," he said. "I'm her brother-in-law. I've been part of this family my whole life. There has to be something in there for—" "There's no clause naming you, Mr. Hendricks," Osei said, glancing down at the folder in front of him. Dorothy was specific on that point. She updated this will herself 4 years back, and she was very clear about the language she wanted used. My father turned to look at me. "Walter, tell him. Tell him there's some kind of understanding between us here." That was the moment. I want to be exact about what happened inside me right then, because it wasn't anger, not the kind you'd expect. It was more like a door I'd been holding open with the toe of my boot for 19 straight years. Finally just swung shut on its own, quiet, no slam to it at all. "There's no understanding, Dad," I said. My voice didn't rise a single note. It didn't need to. You handed me a duffel bag when I was 16 and told me to figure it out. I figured it out. This is exactly what figuring it out looks like. "That's not fair," he said. "That was a different time. Times were hard. You were a difficult kid to manage. You called me 41 times in 5 days, I said. And not one of those calls was to ask how I was doing. Every single one was to find out what you were owed. Dorothy called me every single Sunday for 19 years, he said, his voice cracking now, and never once asked me for a thing. Osei had gone completely still, his pen resting untouched on the folder, watching my father the way you'd watch a smoke alarm you weren't sure was real or not. My mother finally lifted her eyes off her lap, and for the first time in years I saw something cross her face that might have been shame, though I've long since stopped trying to guess at what that woman is feeling. That's not mine to carry anymore either. My father stood there another long moment, his hand twitching at his side like he still wanted something to reach out and grab hold of. Then he sat back down, and he didn't say one more word for the rest of that reading. I signed the paperwork 3 weeks later, at the counter of the very first bakery on Maple Avenue, the same counter Curtis had worked behind for 25 years. He was standing there that morning, same as always, and when I finished signing my name, he reached across and shook my hand, a real handshake, the kind my father used to preach about at the dinner table, and never once demonstrated a single day of his life. Around here, Curtis said, we don't make a man ask twice. I hadn't spoken to my father again after that reading, not for almost a year and a half. And I want to tell you honestly tonight that this isn't quite where the story ends, because something happened 3 months ago that I wasn't prepared for, and it's the reason I'm telling you all of this now, instead of keeping it to myself, the way I've kept most things to myself my whole life. My son Michael called me on a Tuesday evening and told me there was a banquet in Cedar Falls. The Chamber of Commerce was putting on a night honoring longtime local businesses, and Kessler's was being recognized for 50 years serving the community. Michael runs the bakeries alongside Curtis now, since I stepped back a few years ago to let the next generation take the wheel, the same way Dorothy once handed the wheel to me. He asked if Louise and I would come sit at the family table. Of course I said yes. I never once imagined my father would be standing in that same room. But there he was, 81 years old now, thinner than I remembered, walking slower than I remembered, but wearing that same rehearsed smile he'd worn at the will reading, like he'd practiced it in a mirror on the drive over. Somebody must have told him about the banquet to this day, I still don't know who, and he'd shown up uninvited, dressed in a suit that hung loose on him now, working his way through the crowd toward our table, with his hand already extending out in front of him before he'd even reached us. I saw him coming from across the room. Louise squeezed my hand under the table. And I want you to understand, I didn't feel rage in that moment. I didn't feel the urge to make a scene or raise my voice in a room full of people who'd come out to celebrate something good. What I felt was something closer to certainty, a clean, settled kind of certainty that I hadn't carried 19 years earlier in that conference room, and hadn't fully carried even at the reading itself. I turned my back to him. Not dramatically, not for the show of it. I simply turned my chair toward my son and my grandchildren and picked the conversation back up right where we'd left it, and I let my father stand there behind me with his hand out in the middle of a room full of strangers who had no earthly idea what they were witnessing. He didn't say a word. After a moment, I heard him walk away. Michael told me later he saw my father leave through the side door not 5 minutes after that, and nobody at our table ever spoke of it again that whole evening. I don't know if my father is still alive as I'm sitting here telling you this tonight. I haven't asked, and nobody in my family has thought to tell me otherwise. My mother passed 6 years back now, and we made our peace in her final months, in a hospital room in Cedar Falls, the two of us talking quietly about nothing important and everything important, all at the same time. I don't know if that door with my father ever opens again. I'm not holding it shut on purpose, and I'm not holding it open either one. I've simply come to a place where I don't need one single thing that might be sitting on the other side of it anymore, and that is a strange, plain kind of peace to carry around at 63 years old. Not the kind of peace that makes you feel triumphant, just the kind that finally lets you stand up straight inside your own life. My grandson Tommy asked me last month what Aunt Dorothy was like, since he never got the chance to know her himself. I told him she was a woman who showed up. I didn't explain the rest of it to him. I expect he'll come to understand it in his own time, the same way I eventually did. If this story meant something to you tonight, I'd ask you to think on the people in your own life who showed up for you without ever once being asked twice, and maybe find a way to tell them so this week, while you've still got the chance. That's the whole lesson in this, if you're looking for one. Not the money, not the bakeries. Just showing up, plain and simple, for the people who need you to. If you want more stories like this one, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and I will see you all again next time.